pine resin. That's the first thing soldiers notice when they enter the Lyman forest zone. Not artillery, not drones, but the sharp, almost chemical smell of shattered pine sap rising from tree trunks split by shrapnel. In the winter of 2025, those trees were taking dozens of impacts per day. The 95th Separate Air Assault Brigade had been in this forest for weeks. Their sector, the dense pine and birch woodlands stretching northeast of Lyman, along the ridgelines above the Zherebets River Valley in Donetsk Oblast. Their mission, hold ground that Russian forces needed to push deeper into the Lyman corridor, or deny it long enough that holding became irrelevant, because the Russians advancing across the forward slopes would be ground down before they ever arrived. This is the story of how they did it. Not through numbers, not through superior firepower, but through terrain, patience, and a doctrine that turned Russia's aggression into its own punishment. Over the next 34 minutes, we'll reconstruct the 95th Brigade's defense of the Lyman Forest Wedge using geolocated drone footage, open-source mapping, intercept reporting, and unit-level battle damage assessments. We'll walk the terrain from a satellite's eye view, trace the Russian approach routes into pre-registered kill zones, and show exactly how a reverse-slope defense, a doctrine older than the Second World War, became one of the most effective tactical templates of this conflict. The question at the center of this investigation: how does a brigade with fewer vehicles, fewer troops, and less artillery stop a Russian force that has numerical superiority, armor, and unlimited willingness to absorb casualties? The answer sits in the angle of a hillside, in the shadow cast by a pine ridge at Oro 700 in February, in the precise calibration of a drone ISR feed that sees everything Russian forces cannot. Let's start with the ground. The terrain northeast of Lyman is not, on most maps, especially dramatic. No mountain ranges, no wide rivers, no obvious geographic choke points that a staff officer would circle in red at a planning table. What there is instead, a series of low, forested ridgelines, typically 10 to 30 meters of elevation change, running roughly northeast to southwest, separated by swampy low ground, small creek beds, and dense stands of pine that reduce visibility to less than 50 meters in many places. To a conventional military planner, this looks like difficult terrain that slows everything equally. To the 95th Brigade's commanders, it looked like a weapons system. The key geographic feature anchoring their defensive sector was a ridgeline complex roughly 4 kilometers northeast of the Lyman urban area, running parallel to a secondary road network that Russian logistics needed to use. Below the ridges, to the east and northeast, lay the Zherebets River Valley, a natural geographic funnel. Any Russian force wanting to move armor west toward Lyman in meaningful strength had to either use the road network along the valley floor or push through the pine forest on the ridges above. Both options, as Russian commanders would discover repeatedly in 2025, were traps. Russian forces operating along this axis in early to mid-2025 were primarily drawn from formations that had been cycling through the Lyman sector since the failed Russian offensive operations of late 2022 and 2023. Open-source order of battle tracking, including assessments from the Institute for the Study of War and Ukrainian General Staff reporting, indicated the presence of elements from multiple motorized rifle regiments, supported by artillery groupings and tactical UAV assets. These were not elite troops. Many units in this sector had suffered significant attrition through the preceding 2 years and were operating with reconstituted or partially replacement personnel. What they had in quantity: armor, T-72B3 tanks, BMP-2 and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, and the logistical tail to sustain armored pushes for days at a time. They also had artillery, including 152mm systems capable of providing fire support across the ridge complex, and an increasing density of first-person view drone operators embedded at company and battalion level. What they consistently lacked along this axis: good reconnaissance of what waited on the reverse slopes of those ridgelines. Here is the tactical comparison that defined this engagement. Russia had mass, in vehicles, in manpower, in shells. The 95th Brigade had position, and in the specific terrain of the Lyman forest zone, position was worth more than mass. The ridge geometry meant Russian forces advancing on the forward slope were visible, exposed, and engaged the moment they crested into view, while Ukrainian fires were directed from the reverse slope, hidden from both direct observation and flat trajectory Russian anti-tank systems. That asymmetry, replicated across every approach in the sector, became the engine of Russian attrition. Understanding why requires understanding what reverse slope actually means in practice, not as a textbook definition, but as a lived tactical reality in this specific landscape. When Ukrainian brigade commanders chose not to defend the forward slopes of the Lyman ridges, they were making a deliberate choice to give up observation. Forward slope positions see the enemy first. They give you the longest possible engagement range. In flat, open country, forward slope defense is often preferable. But the pine forests of the Lyman zone neutralized much of that advantage. Visibility was already compressed to dozens of meters in many places, and the tree cover that might have concealed Ukrainian defenders on a forward slope also gave Russian infantry and armor some protection as they approached. Reverse slope defense inverts this logic. Ukrainian infantry and anti-tank teams positioned just below the crest of each ridge could not see Russian forces until they were very close, but Russian forces equally could not see them, could not range them with direct fire weapons, and could not coordinate effective artillery suppression against positions invisible from the forward slope. Russian artillery, to be effective against reverse slope defenders, needed precise coordinates. Precise coordinates required either reconnaissance by fire, wasteful, slow, and audible, or ISR assets that could see over the crest. This is where the 95th Brigade's ISR architecture became decisive. Ukrainian drone operators in this sector were running persistent surveillance coverage of the forward approaches using a mix of commercial quadcopter platforms, primarily DJI Mavic 3 variants modified for military use, and longer-range fixed-wing reconnaissance drones capable of loitering above the ridge crest and feeding real-time video to ground stations behind the reverse slope. According to Ukrainian reporting from units operating in this general sector, drone shift rotations were organized to maintain near-continuous daylight coverage of primary approach routes, with thermal-capable platforms extending surveillance into nighttime hours. What this meant operationally, the 95th Brigade could see Russian forces forming up and beginning to advance long before those forces reached the forward slope. The reverse slope positions themselves remained invisible to Russian ground observation, and pre-registered fire missions, coordinates for artillery, mortar, and FPV drone strikes calculated in advance based on likely approach routes, were ready to execute the moment Russian columns entered the target envelope. I spent considerable time working through the geolocated footage from this sector that circulated through open-source channels in early to mid-2025, and one pattern kept returning. The videos, mostly drone footage from Ukrainian-operated ISR platforms, showed Russian vehicle columns advancing along predictable corridors, almost invariably the same ones. The secondary road running northeast from the valley floor, the logging track through the central pine stand, the shallow depression between two ridge spurs that offered what looked like cover from aerial observation, but was in fact directly exposed to the drone view from above the crest. Corridor after corridor, the same geometry repeated. What's most striking about this footage is not the destruction itself. Vehicle losses along this axis were consistent and documented, but the almost mechanical predictability of the approach routes. Terrain channeled Russian movement. Swampy low ground to the north and south of the primary ridgeline complex forced vehicles onto elevated ground. Elevated ground meant predictable paths. Predictable paths meant pre-registered fires. That is how the 95th Brigade's defensive system functioned. Not as a rigid line, but as a layered machine that converted Russian tactical predictability into Ukrainian fire's efficiency. The first layer of that machine was the minefield architecture. Ukrainian engineer units, working in conjunction with the 95th Brigade's organic assets and likely supported by general engineering support at formation level, had seeded the primary approach routes with a combination of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Ukrainian General Staff reporting and open-source analysis of footage from this sector indicated the use of both legacy Soviet-pattern TM-62 anti-tank mines and more modern, remotely emplaced systems. Critically, minefields in the Lyman forest zone were not deployed as simple barriers designed to stop movement. They were deployed as slowdown mechanisms, forcing Russian columns to slow, bunch, deviate, or halt, at which point they became easier targets for the next layer. Behind the minefields came the FPV drone kill zones. Ukrainian FPV drone units in this sector were operating with the kind of target saturation that characterized the 2025 phase of the war across the entire Eastern Front. A single Russian vehicle halted or slowed by a mine strike could be engaged within seconds by a drone operator who had been watching the column advance on his ISR feed and had his drone already airborne, circling at altitude above the engagement area. The FPV systems in use, typically modified racing drone frames carrying shaped charge warheads derived from RPG-7 rockets or purpose-built anti-armor munitions, were not precision systems by traditional standards. But in the compressed terrain of the pine forest, where a halted BMP-2 sat 2 meters off a predictable track, precision was not the limiting factor. Speed was. And FPV operators working from positions on the reverse slope with clear telemetry and practiced approach vectors could execute attacks in under 20 seconds from command to impact. Here's what Russian assault group commanders faced in this environment. Their column enters the forest approach. Within the first 200 meters, the lead vehicle strikes a mine, or the column slows to investigate suspected mines. Drones appear within seconds. Artillery begins falling. Pre-registered coordinates, no ranging adjustment required. The column attempts to reverse or push through. Secondary strikes target the flanks. The forest that seemed to offer concealment has become a sealed compartment. That compartment geometry, the physical enclosure created by terrain, mines, and pre-positioned fires, is the core mechanical insight of the Lyman reverse slope defense. Russian commanders at company and battalion level were not making tactical errors by choosing those approach routes. The terrain gave them limited alternatives. The error was at the operational planning level, committing armor to terrain where the geometry guaranteed attrition without corresponding positional gain. Let's talk about what Russian forces actually lost on this axis and how we can assess those losses through open-source methods. The Oryx project, which maintains the most rigorous open-source database of visually confirmed Russian equipment losses in Ukraine, had, by mid-2025, documented thousands of Russian armored vehicle losses across all fronts, with the Lyman and Kupiansk axes representing a significant share of confirmed ground vehicle attrition. Oryx does not break losses down to the level of specific defensive positions, but the density of confirmed losses geolocated to the Lyman forest sector in the period from late 2024 through mid-2025 was consistent with the pattern described in Ukrainian operational reporting. Repeated assault attempts against prepared defenses, each producing vehicle losses in the range of 1 to 6 confirmed vehicles per engagement, with cumulative losses across the sector running into dozens of vehicles over the relevant operational period. Ukrainian General Staff reporting, cross-referenced with geolocated footage, indicated that Russian armored assault groups attempting to push through the ridgeline complex northeast of Lyman in this period routinely suffered vehicle losses in the first 1 to 300 meters of their approach, consistent with the mine and FPV layering described above. Here is the take that will draw objections from some quarters. The consistent Russian losses in this sector were not primarily the result of Ukrainian skill advantages. They were the result of a Russian operational planning failure that repeated itself month after month. Russian formation commanders knew the approach routes were defended. They knew the terrain favored the defender. They attacked anyway, with insufficient reconnaissance, inadequate counter-drone measures, and no meaningful shift in tactical approach between engagements. That is not an argument against Ukrainian effectiveness. The 95th Brigade and supporting units executed their defense with genuine competence. It is an argument that the most important factor in this attritional equation was Russian institutional rigidity, which proved unable to adapt tactics at the operational level, even when those tactics were demonstrably failing. This matters for understanding the broader pattern. Ukrainian defenders held this sector not because they had resources the Russians lacked, but because they designed a system that punished Russian tactical inflexibility more efficiently than Russian mass could compensate for it. Ask yourself, if you were a Russian battalion commander ordered for the third time in 6 weeks to push a column of BMP-2s up the same logged forest track that claimed vehicles in both previous attempts, what would you do? Based on what the footage shows, many Russian commanders had no operational alternative. They lacked the authority, the resources, or the intelligence to do something fundamentally different. So they sent the column. Again. The obstacle this created for the 95th Brigade was not enemy innovation. It was enemy persistence. Absorbing wave after wave of assault attempts without sustaining cumulative losses that would break defensive cohesion required continuous resupply of mines, FPV munitions, and drone batteries. Ukrainian logistics in the Lyman sector operated under constant pressure from Russian artillery interdiction. Supply runs to forward positions were dangerous. In periods of high Russian operational tempo, ammunition expenditure for drone strikes alone could outpace the forward resupply rate. Ukrainian units addressed this through pre-positioned ammunition caches, buried at multiple points along the reverse slope to reduce single-point vulnerability, and rotating drone operator teams who could recover and recharge equipment during lower-intensity periods. The sustainment challenge was real and ongoing. It imposed a ceiling on the intensity of Ukrainian fires that the defensive system could maintain. But within that ceiling, the system held. The counter-battery dimension of this fight deserves specific attention. Russian artillery operating in support of assault attempts along the Lyman forest axis was a genuine threat to Ukrainian reverse-slope positions. Unlike direct fire systems, artillery can engage targets on the reverse slope if it has accurate coordinates, and Russian counter-battery radar systems, including the 1L261 Zoopark 1M, were capable of detecting Ukrainian artillery fire and generating targeting solutions. Ukrainian self-propelled artillery operating in this sector, primarily 2S-22 Bodana 155mm systems, where available, alongside older Soviet-pattern self-propelled guns, operated under strict shoot-and-scoot discipline, relocating immediately after firing to avoid counter-battery engagement. The Ukrainian advantage in this exchange came from two sources. First, the persistent drone ISR coverage that allowed Ukrainian artillery to detect Russian battery positions and call for counterfire with better target quality than Russian systems could achieve. Second, the coordination between Ukrainian counter-battery radar assets and the brigade's fire support structure, which allowed faster response cycles than the Russian counter-battery chain could match on this sector. According to Ukrainian General Staff reporting during this period, several Russian 152mm artillery systems were destroyed or damaged in counter-battery exchanges along the Lyman axis. The specific numbers are not independently verifiable at the battery level, but the operational pattern, Russian artillery attempting to suppress Ukrainian reverse slope positions, Ukrainian counter-battery strikes disrupting those fires before they could be adjusted, is consistent across multiple sources and fits the tactical logic of the engagement. By mid-2025, the cumulative effect of this attritional dynamic was measurable at the operational level. Russian progress along the Lyman forest axis had, according to ISW mapping and Ukrainian official reporting, been measured in hundreds of meters over periods of weeks, in terrain where the tactical objective would require advancing kilometers to achieve meaningful positional gain. Russian assault groups that managed to reach the forward crest of the ridgeline complex in force rarely held their gains. The reverse-slope defenders, supported by fires from positions the attackers could not directly engage, made sustained occupation of crestline positions untenable. What strikes me about this operational pattern is what it reveals about the broader 2025 dynamic on the Eastern Front. The Lyman Forest sector was not an anomaly. It was one expression of a template that Ukrainian brigades were applying, with variation, across multiple sectors from Kupiansk in the north to Oryx in the south. The template's core logic, terrain selection that maximizes the defender's concealment advantage, ISR architecture that maintains observation without exposing defenders, layered fires that convert predictable approach routes into systematic attrition corridors. The specifics varied. In open-steppe terrain near Oryx, the ISR and fires logic applied to wider engagement ranges and relied more heavily on HIMARS and artillery. In the urban environment of Chasiv Yar, reverse slope equivalents took the form of building depth defense in hardened structures. In the Lyman forest zone, the terrain itself was the primary tool. The pines and the ridges and the swampy ground did most of the shaping work that in other sectors required extensive engineering. One detail that stayed with me from the geolocated footage of this sector: in several drone videos from the forest approach routes, you can see the progression of a Russian vehicle column as the lead element slows, halts, reverses, and in the process forces the vehicles behind it to do the same, compressing the column into a denser target. The mine or obstacle that stopped the lead vehicle didn't destroy it. It created the conditions under which the FPV drone and the mortar that followed did the significant damage. The mine was not the weapon. The mine was the first beat in a sequence that the brigade's planners had choreographed in advance. Every step in that sequence had a follow-on. That level of systems thinking, designing not just for individual weapon effects, but for cascading tactical sequences, is what distinguished effective Ukrainian defense in this period from simple positional resistance. Russian intercepted communications from this period, portions of which circulated through Ukrainian military intelligence channels and were reported by Ukrainian media outlets with access to intelligence sourcing, reflected a pattern of confusion and frustration at the company and battalion level. Commanders reported that drone strikes were appearing from directions inconsistent with where they believed Ukrainian positions to be. Requests for artillery to suppress what turned out to be empty forward slopes. Reports of casualties from mines in locations that reconnaissance had cleared as safe, indicating Ukrainian engineers were conducting nighttime reseeding of previously swept lanes. That last detail is operationally significant. Reseeding swept approach routes with new mines, a process that requires moving engineer teams forward at night, past the forward crest, and back to safety before daylight, is high-risk activity. It demonstrates that the 95th Brigade and supporting units were not merely defending passively, they were actively maintaining the conditions that made the defense effective at continuous cost and risk. The supply traffic interdiction aspect of this fight also warrants analysis. Ukrainian forces along the Lyman axis were not limiting their fires to attacking assault groups directly. Strike packages were being directed at the logistical infrastructure supporting Russian operations in the sector, vehicle assembly areas behind the forward edge, ammunition transfer points, and the road network that brought supplies forward from Russian logistics nodes further east. Ukrainian General Staff reporting during this period indicated strike activity against Russian supply convoys and staging areas in the Lyman Axis rear area, consistent with the pattern of Ukrainian HIMARS and drone strikes observed across the Eastern Front. Targeting supply traffic served a dual purpose. It degraded the material basis of Russian assault attempts directly, and it imposed additional delays on Russian operational planning by forcing longer, less predictable resupply routes. Russian forces operating on consumption-intensive high-intensity assault cycles, burning through ammunition, fuel, and vehicle parts at accelerated rates, were disproportionately affected by interdiction of the short supply lines that sustained their tempo. Will this type of interdiction-combined defense become a standard doctrine for outnumbered brigades? Comment yes or no. We'll look at the most interesting responses in a follow-up video. By late spring 2025, the operational situation along the Lyman forest axis reflected the cumulative result of this attritional exchange. Russian forces had not achieved the breakthrough toward the Zherebets River corridor that operational logic suggested they were seeking. Ukrainian defensive positions along the ridgeline complex remained coherent, though under continuous pressure. The forest between the two forces was marked, sector by sector, by the debris of failed assault attempts, abandoned vehicles, shattered equipment, ground scarred by mine blasts and artillery strikes. If you're following this conflict seriously, and if you've stayed with this breakdown this far, you clearly are. This pattern matters beyond its tactical specifics. The Lyman forest fight is a documented case study in how defensive doctrine scales to material disadvantage. The 95th Brigade was outnumbered in vehicles. They were operating in a sector where Russian artillery could range every point of their defensive zone. They were sustaining continuous pressure over weeks and months, not days. And they held. The mechanism of that holding was not miraculous. It was methodical. Terrain selection, ISR integration, pre-registered fires, layered obstacles, disciplined logistics, counter-battery coordination. Each element individually was familiar from decades of military doctrine. The combination, adapted to the specific terrain and the specific technological environment of the 2025 Donbass front, produced results that the raw force balance would not suggest were possible. Here's what this tells us about the broader trajectory of the conflict. The 2022-2025 period on the Eastern Front produced what might eventually be recognized as a significant body of tactical operational innovation in defensive warfare. Ukrainian brigade commanders, operating under conditions of material disadvantage and constant pressure, developed and refined methods that military analysts will be studying for years. The reverse slope doctrine employed in the Lyman forest zone was not invented by the 95th Brigade in 2025. Its principles appear in World War II field manuals, in NATO doctrine documents, in the lessons of the Korean War's ridgeline fighting. What was adapted, and adaptation is the right word, was its integration with persistent drone ISR, FPV strike systems, and the specific mine layering techniques that made it effective in this terrain and against this enemy. The historical parallel that comes to mind most directly is the UN defensive fighting along the Korean ridgelines in 1951 and 1952, where heavily outnumbered defenders used terrain, prepared positions, and layered fires to impose disproportionate casualties on numerically superior Chinese forces conducting mass infantry assaults. The tactical specifics differ enormously. No FPV drones in Korea, no satellite imagery, no real-time drone ISR. But the underlying logic, use terrain to compress the attacker into predictable corridors, make each meter of advance cost more than the attacker can sustain, hold ground not by matching mass but by multiplying the cost of forward movement, is recognizably the same. Whether history is repeating itself, or whether each conflict finds its own version of the same fundamental defensive logic, is a question worth sitting with. What the 95th Brigade's Lyman Forest defense achieved can be assessed at three levels. At the tactical level, Russian assault groups attacking through the ridgeline complex northeast of Lyman suffered consistent vehicle losses, tracked and wheeled armor, supply vehicles, and supporting equipment across the relevant operational period. Open-source confirmed losses in this general sector, per Oryx methodology, represent a significant material cost. At average assessed values of approximately $1 to $3 million per armored vehicle, even conservative estimates of confirmed losses represent hundreds of millions of dollars in destroyed or damaged Russian military equipment across the Lyman axis in 2025. At the operational level, Russian forces did not achieve the positional objectives that would have allowed them to threaten Lyman from the northeast in force. The Zherebets River Valley corridor remained contested but not penetrated. Ukrainian defensive coherence in the sector held, allowing continued operation of the logistical and fire support networks that sustained the broader Lyman defensive zone. At the doctrinal level, the template demonstrated in the Lyman Forest, ISR-enabled reverse slope defense, pre-registered FPV and artillery kill zones, mine architecture as a sequencing mechanism rather than a simple barrier, had been validated under sustained combat conditions against a numerically superior attacker. That validation matters for how Ukrainian formation commanders approach analogous defensive challenges across the front, and for how NATO military analysts assess the conditions under which defensive doctrine can compensate for mass disadvantage. The question of what comes next in this sector is, as of mid-2025, genuinely open. Russian operational planning along the Lyman axis has shown some adaptation to the attrition they've suffered. Increased use of smaller infantry infiltration groups probing for seams in the Ukrainian defensive network. More aggressive use of their own FPV drone assets to target Ukrainian ISR platforms before they can observe approach routes, and greater use of smoke and obscurance to reduce the effectiveness of Ukrainian drone observation. These adaptations have imposed additional friction on the Ukrainian defensive system. They have not, based on available open-source evidence, fundamentally changed the operational equation. Ukrainian defenders face their own ongoing challenges. The intensity of FPV drone munition consumption in a sector like this is substantial, and the industrial production and forward delivery system supplying those munitions is a continuing vulnerability. Drone operator training and retention, keeping experienced operators in forward positions rather than rotating them out, represents a human capital challenge that compounds over time. And the persistent Russian artillery threat to reverse slope positions, while manageable under current conditions, remains a variable that could shift with changes in Russian artillery supply or targeting intelligence. Could Russia have changed the outcome in this sector if they had earlier adopted a fundamentally different tactical approach, for example, saturating Ukrainian drone ISR with counter-drone systems before committing ground assault elements? Possibly. The Ukrainian defensive system's dependence on persistent drone observation is a known vulnerability, and Russian electronic warfare and counter-drone capabilities have improved across the front in 2025. That pressure is real and ongoing. How does the Lyman Forest template change NATO's thinking about defensive doctrine for outnumbered forces? The answer emerging from this fight points toward ISR integration as the decisive enabler. Not the weapons themselves, but the persistent, real-time observation architecture that makes pre-registered fires effective. NATO planners watching the 2025 Eastern Front data should be asking whether their own brigade-level ISR systems could replicate the persistent coverage that made Ukrainian reverse slope defense functional. And what is the next Ukrainian defensive challenge of this kind? And will Russian commanders recognize it before they've spent another 6 weeks of assault groups in a terrain trap of their own creation? Based on the 2025 pattern, the answer to that last question, unfortunately for Russian tactical effectiveness, appears to be probably not quickly enough. If you found this OSINT breakdown useful, if walking through the terrain logic, the tactical geometry, and the open-source evidence gives you a clearer picture of how this conflict actually operates at the unit level, subscribe. We publish these investigations weekly, drawing on geolocated footage, unit reporting, and open-source intelligence to reconstruct what actually happened on the front lines and why it matters. The Lyman Forest will keep burning pine resin. The ridges will keep shaping movement. and the brigades holding them will keep finding ways to make the terrain work harder than the enemy.